Yeah, you mentioned performativeness. Which reminded me that Paul Babiak, who wrote Snakes and Suits with Robert Hare, he told me that sometimes he's invited, human resources invites him in to try and weed out the psychopaths in the short list of candidates. And he said he was always worried that when he identified the psychopaths, secretly, they'd be the ones given the job. Instead of rooted out, because as well as being performative and being charismatic, and I don't know if there's ever been any studies about physical attractiveness of psychopaths, but certainly anecdotally, psychopaths do well. Like, and I don't know whether it's because whether they have sort of they can make themselves good looking. Often people are attracted by absence, right? People are attracted by people who hold something back, mystery. And with psychopaths, there's a huge absence. There is something missing, it's empathy. So maybe that's got something to do with it. People think they're charismatic and mysterious, but in fact, they're just unempathetic and are faking it. But of course, the other thing is that, and you made a really good point in your book about how very often with psychopaths, it's short term. They're really successful for a while, but then they commit accounting fraud or something happens and it all blows up. And that seems to happen because one of the items on the checklist is irresponsibility and another one is impulsivity. So it stands to reason that if you've got a proper high scoring psychopath in power, it's going to go wrong eventually. It's not going to last forever. But the other thing, of course, is when you're talking about psychopaths at the top of a company, if you're happy to just shut down factories and fire people without any remorse, then the shareholders are going to love you. So I think the other thing is not only does psychopathy make you want to, propels you from the inside, because when you have no empathy, what's left is just the will to win, but also society is rewarding psychopathic character traits, especially shareholders.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem in business, of course, and it's a problem depending on the culture of the area as well, because if you're somebody who's unable to sort of discipline your psychopathic or dark triad traits, you're going to get exposed at some point, unless you have, like Putin does, the ability to basically kill people who try to expose you, right? So, I mean, this is one of the things that I think is quite dangerous around psychopaths in certain contexts in less democratic areas, for example, is when people try to sort of be the whistleblower. There's a culture of fear around that person. Whereas here, that's why a lot of the psychopathy experts told me there's a pretty strong line between the functional and dysfunctional, because the functional can, dial it down when they need to. And that's why in the book I read about this psychopathic janitor who, he just can't control it. He just, these people crossing.
Yeah, will you briefly tell his story? This is Rauchi, because it's a great, and I should say one thing I really like, we talked about this before this started, is that there's certain areas that I can't get into because I just don't know how to write about them, and neuroscience is one. But you do write about neuroscience, and you write about it entertainingly, which is no mean feat. The thing that always annoys me about neurologists, by the way, is that they talk to you for hours about like the brain and this and that, and then at the end they always end it by saying, but of course we have no idea how the human brain right. But you're very good at going to those places, studies neurology, but also telling really great unfolding human stories, including the story that you're about to tell.
Yeah, so Steve Rauchi, he's a janitor, was a janitor in Schenectady, New York, and it's an amazing story of the sort of combination of ambition and psychopathy, even at the sort of smaller stages of power that you wouldn't think of it. So his sort of main goal was to become a senior level maintenance official in the Schenectady school district, right? So hardly the president of the United States, but he was a junior level official at the time. So he starts scheming, and the schemes are amazing. Like they have this idea of trying to cut energy usage in the school so that they can save some money. And so they set up this new sort of energy management software. And the guy who's put in charge of it is like, I don't know how to operate computers. And Steve Rauchi, of course, comes in and says, oh, don't worry, I'll take care of it. No problem. I'll run it and you can take all the credit. What Steve Rauchi does when this guy's not looking is he turns all the lights on over the weekends, on the public holidays. He turns the football lights on the stadium so that at the end of the day, the bosses look, and the energy usage has gone up under this guy who's supposed to be in charge of cutting it. So they fire him and they give Rauchi the job, and he sort of slowly eliminates his enemies. And when they start to occasionally blow the whistle on him, he vandalizes their homes. He writes "rat" in spray paint on the home of one of his subordinates, and then makes his coworkers go in the car in like a pilgrimage to observe what happens to people who cross him. And he speaks about himself in the third person. One of the great court transcript bits was this piece of evidence where someone said that he told them that the only regret he had from his childhood was that he wishes he had a friend that was his identical clone, so that he would have had a Steve to go to as well when he was a kid. So anyway, ultimately he starts placing explosives on the cars, and in his office he had explosives. This is at a school, right? So he gets caught and sentenced to quite a long prison sentence. He's still in jail. Again, a pandemic casualty in the sense that I was hoping to go and visit him and wasn't able to fly. It's like March 16th of 2020. I was going to go to Schenectady. So anyway, the point is that he's one of these great cases of someone who psychopathy worked for a little while. Like he really did climb the chain. He was a major official in the union. He became a very well-paid person in the sort of district maintenance office. And then it all fell apart when he started to be unable to control those impulses that you talked about, Jon.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I'm curious because I always really look out for good portrayals of psychopaths in movies and TV shows. And there's a TV drama I watched quite recently, which I won't name in case I don't want to give out any spoilers. But it's about somebody escaping from prison, and they use the word psychopath isn't mentioned at all in the drama. It's not about psychopaths, but it felt really beautifully written as a psychopathic character. And he uses all of his, his Machiavellianism to charm people to get out of prison. And once he gets out of prison, one of the first things he does is drink contaminated water from a dirty puddle and gets really sick. And I just thought that what a great, again, I don't know if this is deliberate or not, but for me, that was a great rounded psychopathic portrayal, because they always fuck up. Like they get to a very good position, but they're not. The charm is superficial, and there's irresponsibility and impulsiveness under the surface. So they always screw up, which is a worrying thing when we think about Putin. But can I lead on? So here's something really interesting. Is there's another leader who's in everybody's minds right now, who doesn't seem, from what we know about him, to have like any of those traits. I've got this sort of half-formed thought, which I haven't actually said out loud, so I'll try and say it out loud. Is in the same, I wonder, like, look, if this is like a shit thought, just, I'm willing to accept it. But okay, in the same way that social media, I wrote a book that was critical of public shaming, so you've been publicly shamed, but yes, obviously in the last few years some very positive things have come from social media and elements of shaming. You've got Me Too and you've got Black Lives Matter and so on. And I wonder whether Zelensky, in the same way that social media has shifted power in society, whether the power of social media, which Zelensky utilizes so well, may break our love of strongmen and psychopathy and so on. So maybe Zelensky he sort of bucks the trend because he's a product in a way of social media, and that is such a powerful new thing. It may change everything that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, I think the way that it does and it doesn't change, I think it's a good thought. It's not a half-formed thought, but I think the way it changes things depends on where you are. So in Russia, for example, there's a lot of effort put into controlling the media, and so Putin still enjoys significant popularity among his own people because he's got a stranglehold on the propaganda machine around him. So a lot of them aren't seeing Zelensky. I mean, there's obviously a certain segment of the Russian population that's online, that's sort of circumventing any of the censorship that exists and is still seeing like the real story. But I think that the problem is that the domestic audience in these places is often very well controlled. You see this in the fact that, it was yesterday, they bombed the TV station, the TV antenna, to knock off, the local media in Kyiv. Now, that didn't work, because that's not the way people were getting their feed of Zelensky. They were getting it in real time on Twitter. And it's a huge problem for all these autocrats, because it used to be the area of extreme vulnerability, was this moment of sort of disconnected conversation between the leader and the population. So like, I used to, part of my PhD, I studied coups and how coups happen. And coups happen the most when a leader is out of the country or is sick. Because what happens is somebody strikes and they don't have an ability to sort of say, hey, wait a minute, I'm here, I'm safe, I'm still in charge, right? I mean, Zelensky, when there's all this sort of dark propaganda coming towards him that says Zelensky's fled, we have reports he's out of Kyiv, and he goes on Twitter 2 minutes later in the streets. I mean, it's just absolutely calling out the lies in real time in a way that's really charismatic. But I think Zelensky also, he poses an interesting issue for my argument, because I'm arguing, obviously, in the book that like disproportionately bad people get power, and they absolutely do, I think. Zelensky, I think, has risen to the occasion. The problem is that you can't ever figure out how someone's going to behave in this situation, because you can't test run an invasion. So my problem, and this is why the last chapter of the book is called Waiting for Cincinnatus, referring to this sort of, the good leader who emerges in a crisis is Cincinnatus, who willingly gives up power and all this stuff. Zelensky's got this. But the problem is, every once in a while, it's like a lottery. You win the lottery, your country gets invaded. You've got Zelensky instead of Putin in charge of you, or you've got Zelensky instead of the guy who flees, like in Afghanistan. And I think the problem is we've just engineered a society where we're beholden to chance. We basically get lucky sometimes when our leaders turn out to not be awful, whereas most of the time, you get the test and they fail, basically.
Right. Although, I assume, Zelensky became leader of Ukraine in large part because of his not superficial charm, but real charm.
Sure.
The fact that he played Paddington Bear and he was on Dancing with the Stars and was a much loved comedian. So here was somebody who was attractive to the electorate and didn't, as far as I know, didn't seem to display any of the kind of traits, even when he was coming up. That you talk about in the book. Now, this isn't like I should say, like, we have disproportionate amount of psychopathy at the top of society, but that doesn't mean everybody at the top of society is a psychopath. So none of this is a crazy thought that there's somebody who's a completely charming non-psychopath in charge of Ukraine, but it's still interesting to talk about, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the other thing that I think about a lot is when Zelensky comes to power is this sort of moment of democratic reform in Ukraine, right? So there's this idea of this sort of rebirth. It's a new direction for Ukraine, et cetera, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why Putin is so upset about it and wants a Kremlin-friendly stooge in his place. I think that matters because one of the main points I make in the book is this idea that rotten systems attract rotten people, and good systems that are moving in a better trajectory can attract better people because they're drawn to the idea of a sort of, virtuous cycle. And I talk about this not just in the sense of politics, but also with policing. And I think this is one of the areas where, portrayals of what it means to be in power really, really matter. If you present power as this thing where you crush your enemies, the people who want to crush their enemies are going to try to do it, right? Which is why you have cycles, even in countries that may have better chances of reform structurally, the crop of leaders they tend to get are really awful. The other thing, linking it back to the psychopaths, is, I crunched the numbers at one point in my own academic research about like what happens to leaders who lose power in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the most dangerous places to lose power. And in this 50-year period after independence, 43% of the leaders who lost power were jailed, exiled, or killed. So it's like a coin flip, right? Now, one of the things that people who study psychopaths talk about is discounting risk, or perhaps, as you talked about, forgetting the pain. And you think, okay, who's so overconfident? Who's so willing to sort of roll the dice if they're going to say, oh, all those chumps, they ended up in jail or killed after they lost power, but not me. I'm the one who will game the system better. So I think in places like Haiti, for example, where the record of people losing power is basically death for a significant chunk of the country's history, you're going to have a self-selection of people who systematically discount risk in an irrational way. And so, there's systems that I think affect even within the world of power, it's like, it's not a uniform process. And perhaps the fact that there was a democratic groundswell in Ukraine may have made it more likely that you have genuinely reform-minded people who wanted to get to the top in that sort of optimistic moment.
Cool. Before we open it up, which I will after this question, you say in the book that politics doesn't factor in the top 10 professions where psychopathy is most prevalent, but that's only because it's such a small sample size. They haven't managed to find a way to get it into the top 10. How many of the top 10 do you remember? Jobs with psychopaths.
This is like the pop quiz part. I mean, we've got journalists in there, right? So I believe there's lawyers. What else do we have? There's a lot of media specific ones. Yeah, I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but
that's interesting. Why do you think it is? Psychopaths like to be where things are happening, and I guess journalists like to be where things are happening.
Yeah,
that's probably one reason.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I put it in the book and I included it, but I do think that the sample sizes were problematic on this one. It's why I don't remember it perhaps as well as I should, because I mean, I think that anytime you try to rank professions, you can do, some analyses, but they're not doing the in-depth research by profession that you need to have to do a rigorous assessment. It's the same why I included, because it was funny, the sort of geographical regions where psychopathy is represented. But like at some point, it's going to be a little bit random with perhaps some skews towards, the big cities where some of these professions are overrepresented.
Oh, there's a famous line from a Scottish psychiatrist, which I think has been disputed, and I can't remember whether I put it in the psychopath test or not, but I certainly remember someone telling me it, which was somebody asked this eminent Scottish psychiatrist, prison psychiatrist, what percentage of Scottish prisoners are psychopaths, and he said none, because all the psychopaths are in London prisons. And I think his point was one of the items on the checklist is need for stimulation, proneness to boredom. So you want to gravitate towards the big city, the capital city.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense to me. And also, I think the narcissism elements, because the dark triad traits, which tend to be correlated with one another. I mean, if you're narcissistic and a psychopath, then the narcissism might be driving you into journalism. I mean, it's an exhilarating experience the first time that lots of people are reading your byline or watching you on TV and so on. So it's one of those things where you can imagine it selects for these things, but it's all about disproportionate, right? Like I always make this point because I'm not talking that everybody in power is bad. Like people, I send the book to various people who are actually, they're interviewed but not included in the book, and they're like, were you thinking that I was some awful person all along? And I'm like, no, I'm trying to understand how power operates. I'm not insinuating that everybody I spoke to was a vicious psychopath. Right. Although to be fair, the people who I interviewed who aren't portrayed very well in the book, they didn't get a copy, so I'm just not trying to advertise how I wrote about them necessarily.
That's probably what it is. Okay, well, I'll open it up. What you said about the first time you see your byline, though, I completely get that. I was on it was smash hits, 1985, and I had reviewed Rob Reiner's film Stand By Me, and I saw my byline, and I think I did look around the tube carriage and think, you losers, you're not in smash hits. Anyway, let's open it up to okay. Cam asks, do historians, political scientists spend too long focusing on those who wield power and too little on those who have it wielded against them?